Good evening. Welcome to another edition of The World Tonight. I'm Peter Capote, joined with Adam Lawless,
Hello.
host. And tonight we have a very loaded schedule, so we'll get right to it. And we are discussing the very historic, groundbreaking New Zealand election. Jacinda Ardern defied expectations and did win a majority when some polling was suggesting she was going to fall short. And she has rewritten the landscape of New Zealand's politics. Meanwhile, the Nationals suffered their worst defeat since 2002, and the coalition partners, New Zealand First, of the current government were wiped out. And the other two minor parties, the ACT and the Greens, also had great nights. I'll let Adam explain a little more in detail the final results.
Yep, so as Peter said, this is definitely a historic election, primarily because the Labour Party were able to grant themselves an overall majority of 64 seats with 49.15% of the vote. This is the first time ever of a majority government since the adoption of mixed member proportional in 1996. Now, looking at the other parties, as Peter just said, National received their second worst ever result, and looking a bit more at the other best results, the classical liberal sort of libertarian ACT party received their best ever results of 10 seats. The second best for them was 9 seats. They came third with 7.98% of the vote. And some other historic parts of this election is the Green Party were able to win their first ever electorate since 1999. And another important note is the Maori Party re-entered Parliament via a Maori electorate, and this is their first seat since they lost all of their seats in 2017. So broadly, this is a very important election for New Zealand because it allows really Jacinda Ardern to determine what sort of government she wants to be running here. We're seeing sort of conflicting ideas of what she's going to go for. There are some ideas she'll go for a sort of third way social democratic approach, a more centrist approach, if you will, to try and sustain national party voters who are a bit more centre right, and keep them within her electoral coalition for the next election in 3 years' time. However, there are also talks that they'll try and include the Green Party within some form of coalition, despite having a majority, to try and appeal to their more left-wing voters. So there are definitely conflicting ideas of what this government is actually going to stand for. But the real key thing to look at is that the opposition is quite divided between a sort of progressive left and a centre-right to classical liberal. So she sort of, well, will have the power for the next 3 years pretty much uncontested.
Yes, and I think that's a fair point. Also should be noted with that Maori pickup that it was the only seat the Labour Party lost on a very historic night. So there's always that dubious, distinction for the Labour MP who lost it, but returned on the list. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the opposition. It will now be interesting to see what happens with Judith Collins. She's scheduled to meet with her caucus next week about, retention. It's expected she should be returned to the leadership of the National Party, but it will be interesting to see in the next few years whether she's challenged potentially internally again, because the Nationals seem to have, embraced the Australian Liberal strategy of the evolving door with leadership. Just unfortunately for them, they just don't win elections. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see in her case. I mean, two names who have been rumored, obviously, though both have have said that they have no interest in the job, are Christopher Luxton, who is a former CEO of New Zealand Air, who is at times has been compared to John Key, the very successful national leader of the last 15 years, and her deputy Paul Goldsmith, who is the number 2, but both have said they have no intention of challenging her at the current moment. But it will be interesting to see how she works as an opposition and also how the other opposition parties work.
Yeah, I think the key thing to see here with Collins is specifically how she frames her type of opposition. I see parallels in Keir Starmer here, where you have a figure with a government with a substantial majority and has to try and play themselves as the responsible character, trying to defend certain interests and ensure that the government doesn't stray too far from certain elements. And I think that's definitely how they carry themselves forward. And another interesting element to look towards is how the left-wing progressive parties are able to oppose the government in their own sense. So as I was talking about previously, there are rumors of the Green Party possibly being included in this government. However, there is also this element that they could form their own opposition, possibly with the Maori Party, to try and ensure that their legislative agenda is carried through and possibly is able to be promoted for the next election in 3 years, specifically around a wealth tax, which is something that Labour has rejected, or Labour leadership has rejected, and the Greens have embraced. So that will definitely be an element there where the Green Party could form its own sort of unofficial opposition to try and court those progressive voters away from Labour.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it'll be interesting to see, of course, how the Greens approach that. Are they more aggressive towards the government? Do they play we support certain elements of government but don't support this? It's going to be very interesting also with the economic recovery aspect with COVID due to the tourism industry of New Zealand pretty much being decimated. And I think also the other interesting thing will be, if for the other two opposition parties, Maori, you said, who they align their interests with. And the ACT really, has, if there's any opposition party that has the most to possibly lose the next 3 years, it might be them. They had a good performance under David Seymour, gaining 9 seats, but there's an argument to be made that the Nationals very much will be going for their heads to win back many of the voters they lost in the last election, both centrist and right-wing voters.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other element to look towards is how National we have to look at New Zealand first, failing to not only pass electoral threshold. As I said, they only got 2.67% of the vote. But if they're able to claw back in the next 3 years, especially because that sort of seems to be the cycle that they go through, this element of going into government, failing to sustain themselves afterwards, and going back in, sort of like a revolving door. But who knows if that will actually be able to carry itself forward and sustain itself, and also where those voters may be going if they don't decide to back New Zealand First next time. Because you could argue that a lot of, or some element of ACT support is coming from New Zealand First because of their more right-wing social rhetoric. But yeah, that's definitely something that ACT Party is going to have to watch out for in the future. They're the ones that if I was looking at overall who's the most vulnerable in the next election, I'd say that is definitely ACT, just because of how fractured their coalition could become.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, spot on analysis. And I think the other thing will be interesting is Ardern now has her majority, but the system, mixed member proportional votation, is very hard, to keep that majority, at the next election. So it's, they have to make probably the best that they can use with this system. And as mentioned, they're going to have a lot of challenges ahead of themselves, in the next 3 years.
Yep, exactly. And I think the final note I'd probably leave this on, or at least for me, is that, as you said, Labour is definitely, it feels like this isn't going to be something that's sustainable for them, especially because of how unique the circumstances have been to actually promote Labour into this government. So they definitely have to do some unique form of economic, just looking at what the problems they face now, the economic response is going to be one of the key things there. So if they're not able to adequately perform with that, or the opposition is able to spin it in a way that's effectively, undermining them, it's definitely going to be something that they're going to have to try and handle with. But that's all I have to say on the matter.
And my final point on the topic, mainly at the same point as Adam, I think the other thing to keep note is I think Jacinda Ardern is a very talented politician. She's, got to power very much in a, surprise, pulling it up, comeback win in 2017. And this time she won on the heels of a very popular response to COVID. But it should be noted that, for all her, the popularity of her, she has made mistakes and at times, gotten away with it because of the good things, handling of Christchurch and this. So it'll be interesting to see, and we see this historically with a lot of politicians who run on, good management and luck. When does it finally break? If it does, for her? Well, go ahead.
I would say, yeah, well, it could definitely break because
Yeah.
we saw with the Christchurch response that the polling being in her favour was definitely something that dragged down later on. It was really the COVID crisis and that effective response is what was able to boost them back up. So yeah, exactly what you say. Who knows if this is going to be something that they can keep up.
Yeah, I think we've hit the topic enough, and I'll let you lead off on our next topic, Adam.
Right, yes. So another election, this time going all the way to South America with Bolivia. So this is a country that has been taken by turmoil and internal violence ever since Evo Morales was essentially, well, either overthrown in some interpretations or taken by popular movements. But essentially, his successor, his chosen successor, Luis Arce, has been elected with a pretty decisive majority, beating his nearest rival by about 20 points or so, therefore avoiding a second round runoff. He has taken the presidential election, as well as the fact that his party has also retained majorities in both houses of the Bolivian legislature. So there's definitely a revitalized socialist movement within Bolivia that has definitely seemed to have been suppressed during this time period of Morales being taken down and where we are now. Just a final interesting thing before I pass it over to Peter to talk about some comments is how off the polls were with this particular election. I'd say comfortably most polls predicted that they would be in the range of 10%. A second round would likely come off, and Arce would could possibly have avoided a second round, but he was about the 40%. Or in fact, most recent totals, I think. Let me just check quickly. Last time I checked, it hadn't been fully counted yet. But
No, the current polling, just to because
yes,
I have, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was saying.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you go. Apologies.
Yeah, so he's on 55.1% with his closest rival, Carlos Mesa, at 28.8%. So polling got this entirely off, which is fascinating to see from that perspective. But yes, I'll pass it over to Peter to talk about some comments on this.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention the polling as well. The polling had this race being much closer than it was, and for Bolivia's left, this is a very, very big, win, especially with what happened with Evo Morales. Depending who you ask, it was a coup, liberation, freedom, etc. Again, folks, that's for your interpretation. We're not getting into that because we don't want nasty comments coming our way from whatever sphere of the world this may be. But yeah, I think it's interesting in Arce's case. He was a protege of Morales. He was Minister for the Economy and Public Finance. So it'll be interesting to see the influence that a lot of Morales' ideas will have on this new government that now will face, as we mentioned, ironically, with New Zealand, economic problems with COVID. The response in Bolivia with COVID has been seen as a disaster. That the current government Janine Áñez has been seen as weak on the issue and failing to materialize. So it will be interesting to see what happens, especially now with the movement for socialism and political instrument for the Sovereignty of People's Party having the majority, all the chambers of parliament and the presidency. What they do now to revitalize, and it also is interesting to see the Latin American left. It seems slowly making a revival. We've seen in Argentina. The left came back and beat a very pro-business president. We've now seen this in Bolivia. Return of the left, and we may very well see in other Latin American countries in the next few years the left possibly making a return. And one to look out for would be Colombia, possibly having its first leader from the left ever. So it's an interesting phenomenon to possibly see the resurgence of a leftist slash left of center, mostly left wing politics reviving itself in Latin America.
Yeah, this is particularly important for a candidate like Arce, primarily because a lot of his, credentials come from his time as finance minister, where poverty saw drastic reductions, the economy saw great growth, and ultimately people felt like their lives were ultimately better. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the main issues that I've seen raised with the Morales government is less the economic policies and so forth, which is sort of what he is pushing forward. So obviously there's the good there, but the Morales government would criticize for its authoritarianism. And that is the key element that he can sort of push aside. And who knows if that's the sort of type of thing he'll embrace. We have no real idea at this stage, because it was definitely a Morales-led endeavor to see himself, basically force through this ability to expand how many terms he could possibly serve by pushing through his own judges in courts and so forth. But the key thing here is definitely, yes, the economy, which the credentials are apparent, and obviously voters see that and have voted for that, but also the COVID-19 response, which is, as Peter was saying, it's been effectively awful. The last time I checked, Bolivia had the third highest deaths per capita, which is devastating to see for such a poor, small country that is quite poor as well. So the actual ability to respond to that is going to be a lot more difficult than other countries. But yes, as I was saying before, it's just been fascinating to see how incorrect the polls were in this situation, especially because a lot of them saw that a possible runoff could have seen Carlos Mesa possibly winning. So yes, fascinating to see what went wrong there. But I think Bolivia is definitely going to be an interesting one to look towards, primarily to see if the economic response does work and see how that benefits other left-wing movements within the region, but also how if this authoritarianism will rise once again. And I mean, I'm not going to beat around the bush with this and say that the more right-wing government of Ibanez was any better, because ultimately they still engaged in suppressive tactics and calling off election and delaying it as much as possible. But it's something that obviously you have to hope that people aren't subjected to this kind of thing in the future. But yes, that's the main takeaways from this, and it was definitely interesting to watch. It's very little of it is actually covered on the media, at least of what I've seen so far in terms of the results itself. So if people want a good source for just Latin American politics in general, America Elects is a fantastic one.
Very good.
So definitely follow them. They look at not to plug them or anything, but they look at polling within Brazil in terms of like city elections and so forth. So if you're really hyper into that kind of thing, that's a great source to go towards. And they were great for the results as well.
Friends of Elections Daily, of course. But yeah, I think your points are absolutely correct. I think the interesting team as well. What role does Evo Morales play in this new government? Since he still looms large. There have been accusations that this is going to be a figurehead government, mostly led by him. So it'll be interesting to see if puts a distance between Morales and say I'm my own government, or there is some connection to go back to his government. Obviously, economically, Morales. It led Bolivia in a very economically successful way. Of course, the criticism was the authoritarianism and interference with judiciary. So it'll be interesting to see if that returns, as you mentioned, or this is a new path forward for Bolivia, which has been decimated, with its poor communities, indigenous and native Bolivians as well, being hit hard by the COVID pandemic.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yes, on that note, we will move to the third topic, and this is news from today, and I'm just going to push this one a little up. He's the historic Israel and Sudan announcement made today at the White House. Adam can explain a little more of what this means.
So yes, this comes as the third country to normalize relations with Israel. Members of the Arab League that have normalized. Obviously, the first was the UAE, and I believe Bahrain was the second. And yes, this is a particularly interesting one for a number of reasons, but I'll just give a broad overview of what normalization of ties actually means. So in this specific context, they hope to expand economic and trade relations with an initial focus on agriculture. So in the future, delegations between the two countries are set to meet to discuss issues about farming, about technology, about migration, that kind of thing. But also, the real interesting part about this is the allegations that, I say allegations, this idea that this this actual, I guess, normalization of ties is coming with the fact that the US is changing Sudan's designation as a state sponsor of terror or terrorism. So initially, the reason why that I labeled it as an allegation is because the US government has liked to see this as a separate thing, as completely unrelated to the actual normalization of ties. However, the Sudanese government, or the transitional government, has made it clear that this was a requirement for them to actually normalize ties with Israel in the first place. So that's an interesting element to look at. And then finally, the Palestinian reaction, just with the other two, normalization of ties, that has not been good. Palestinian leaders have reacted by calling this a serious stab in the back of Palestinian and Sudanese people. And this being the fact that the Arab League essentially said initially that there should be no cooperation with Israel until there is a Palestinian state established. Now, obviously, there isn't a Palestinian state, and Palestine feels quite betrayed by the fact that they're being circumvented in this element. But yes, that is my overall comments on the overall agreement.
Yes, on my view, full disclosure, I sort of take the pro-Israel lane here. So anyone who alleges bias, I already said it firsthand for you. I think this is a monumental deal, especially with what has happened in the span of Israel not having a lot of recognition in the region to now UAE, Bahrain, now Sudan, and obviously the rumored more countries that are on the way. And I think it really, as mentioned here, and this is not to become a repeat cliche, is a changing wind of the region. The Middle East is changing. The Palestinian cause is being pushed aside. And bluntly, it's because, in the eyes of many Arabs, it's not the important thing anymore. The more important thing is, obviously not in the case of Sudan. Sudan, as mentioned by Adam, is a different little ball game. But in the case of many of these Arab Gulf states, it's Iran, the threat of Iran. And they see Israel as a partner militarily and economically that can support them against Iran, is why they think this is the time for normalization. Now, in the case of Sudan, Sudan has had a very massive change in the last year, especially with the longtime head of the country's regime being thrown out by the military, and the military claiming, of course, you have to take this in the African continent with a lot of pause. The transition to democracy is on the way. Of course, we take that with heavy skepticism here on this broadcast.
Yes.
But it is a change. Obviously, their big, win for Sudan is that they are off the U.S. terrorism list, state sponsors of terrorism list, which means they can now be opened up economically to U.S. goods, which will, help their economy desperately. And also now with Israel, they'll be opened up to the Israeli market, and that will allow a lot more commerce to come in. So, on the Sudan perspective, this might be more economic than actual ethics itself. To open up its market space, just because now we'll have the U.S. and Israel's market space, and probably acquiring some Israeli technology, which a lot of countries are very intrigued and interested in getting as well. And for the Palestinians, this seems to be the new normal now of backstabbing and betrayal. I think this is I think the copy and paste now. I think of every new Palestinian statement every week now with their former allies. I see that the writing department there and PR are having a fun time, but it really just shows. I think this isn't, and I can understand that the Palestinian cause is in their minds that had been betrayed, but really shows that. They really haven't adjusted to the new normal of this world. Yes, 2020 has had a lot of new things, but it genuinely looks like the Palestinians are really behind on this new ball game, and that they're the ones suffering for not understanding, that the world basically is looking the other way now.
Yeah, and really what this does is only push them closer to Iran, which is the other element to look at, and we're possibly seeing a more militaristic Palestine who recognizes that a two-state solution isn't really coming anytime soon. Another interesting note, just to quickly add, is that this isn't, this normalization of ties, this historic shift, isn't supporting Benjamin Netanyahu domestically. Ultimately, he's still seeing his polling shows his seat count hovering at about 27, 26 to 30, with the right-wing Settlers Party, Yamina, outflanking him from the right, being as close as 24 seats to his 27. So just domestically here, this, extensive diplomatic shift in the region really isn't helping him out domestically because of the COVID-19 response. Interestingly, you could see a parallel here with Donald Trump and his own situation with the presidential election. These are historic negotiations that his administration has negotiated, but ultimately, domestically, it doesn't seem like people care there either, because of more pressing issues, obviously. But no, definitely interesting internationally to see where this is going to go, especially because it seems like domestically for Palestine or the Palestinian-administered regions, there isn't. This is going to see a significant shift and to be towards more militaristic. And then finally, it doesn't seem to be helping their own domestic situation. But I think that's the main highlights from this.
I'll just wrap up my final thoughts, then we'll move on to Libya. I think that's fair analysis. I also think with Bibi Netanyahu, one of the interesting snippets today was President Trump, tried to get Bibi on the spot to say that Joe Biden, who, if the polls are correct, would become president-elect, would not have negotiated this. And a very interesting soundbite from Netanyahu was, "We'll be happy to take anything from any American leader," which really tells me that Netanyahu is really getting ready, is trying to, in a sense, unlike maybe his boss, Barack Obama, when he was vice president, to have a warmer relationship with, I said, Joe Biden administration, which is really telling to see that this afternoon.
And it's particularly fascinating because one of the striking moments from the Israeli elections is a massive poster, or massive billboard, I guess, of Bibi and Trump shaking hands, and that being a bit of an election spin for Likud. But definitely seems like that type of strategy is shifting significantly. I mean, he named a settlement in the Golan Heights after Donald Trump. So it's these fascinating elements that he's now recognizing that for Israel to sustain itself, specifically at a diplomatic time where it seems like a two-state solution has been thrown out the window. So internationally, their situation is going to be so tense, really. But obviously, they now have backing of new Arab allies. But yes, ultimately, it's going to be fascinating to see how a Biden administration handles someone like Netanyahu, especially as they're in such a precarious situation, and with the possibility of a Prime Minister Bennett in the future.
My next point. Prime Minister Bennett is not an impossible thing now.
Bennett being the leader of Yamina, for those who do not know.
And sorry, I'll let you go. And then
but he would take a way more hard line on the issue of Palestine. They believe that the construction of settlements should be legal and would pursue that openly. A lot of their voters are concentrated in those regions, especially in the West Bank. But to see how they would be able to play the world diplomatically, because of this precarious situation they've negotiated themselves into, would be very interesting. But I'd love to hear the fun fact, Peter.
Well, no, I was going to mention with Bennett that he actually would, if he were to become Prime Minister of Israel, would become the first ever Israeli American, or I should say American Israeli, whatever way you want to say it, becoming PM in that case. And
that is very true.
Yeah, because he is an American citizen. But yeah, I think the point made is if Bennett were to become PM, and it's possible. He and Netanyahu, of course, have had very strained relations in the last few years, especially at the last negotiations over coalition arrangements. Bennett, of course, would take a harder line on the Palestinian issue. As noted by Adam, his party very much doesn't believe in the Palestinian issue at all, and basically views that as land for Israel developers to make some nice settlements.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
But no, it'll be interesting to see, and interesting to see how the region changes. And I mean, no one could have guessed a few years ago that an Israeli, flag and a UAE flag will be seeing each other at nice little conferences now. So that's that's the world at hand. But anyway, moving on to other news in the Middle East / that part of the world. So news out of Libya today with a ceasefire, and Adam can explain this developing story.
Yes, Libya's warring sides, that being the government, or the internationally recognized government of national accord, and that of the military commander Khalifa Haftar and his Libyan National Army, have signed a permanent ceasefire across the country. And this is coming from the UN Libya mission. So there are some very important takeaways from this ceasefire agreement, which includes some other elements. Obviously, the main one being this ceasefire affecting the entirety of the country, but the other elements being that it includes the removal of all mercenaries and foreign fighters within 3 months, which is particularly interesting to note because the Libyan National Army is supported by Russian mercenaries, and the government of national accord is backed by Syrian foreign fighters sent over by Turkey. So foreign fighters and mercenaries are a key element of the actual on-the-ground situation. So to have them a part of it is quite significant. Furthermore, it will see the return of internal flights and road transport. They are hoping to negotiate a joint budget, taking both sides from the government of national accord and Libyan National Army to work out a situation economically within the country. There are going to be further political talks next month in Tunisia, as well as planned elections in 2021. Now, the talks in Tunisia are expected to announce the leaders of an interim unity government, as well as more concrete plans for elections. And I think the key note to look here is that this really just reflects the situation on the ground. So just to summarize a very complex bit of a civil war right now. But the Libyan National Army has sort of been forced into a stalemate very recently after the Turkish intervention in favor of the government national cause sort of threw it towards the GNA's favor, as well as the fact they failed to seize Tripoli, which is the capital city of Libya. So those elements definitely mean that the situation is a stalemate on the ground. So key stakeholders have to actually go to the negotiating table, and this is sort of being reflected by this ceasefire. The final things I'll add on this little brief introduction is that Russia is refusing to remove its mercenaries, and Turkey refuses to remove its Syrian foreign fighters. So the allies of these two warring sides are definitely going to have an issue, as they have to try and talk to their allies and to negotiate a means to get them to remove their fighters. And finally, I think it should be noted that there have been ceasefires like this before, so some skepticism has been seen by some experts in the area, but it will definitely be concentrated on these political talks next month in Tunisia, because they'll really determine the future of the country and who gets to hold power, that kind of thing, which is what is the real element that's going to be the issue here.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. I think militarily, the two sides really didn't have anything left to push for. I mean, the failure to capture Tripoli by oh my, I'm forgetting which side again. Oh my.
Sorry, say again.
The side that failed to capture Tripoli. I apologize.
That's the Libyan National Army.
Thank you, the Libyan National Army. Long day at school. Not getting that was a big blow to them, and for the national government of course, holding on to that was a monumental victory. And this ceasefire, of course, is fragile, as mentioned, because of Turkey and Russia, but it is very good for the region to see that this hopefully, this was put to rest, and that Libya, for the first time in a long time, can have a normal returned normalcy. Obviously, Libya has not been in a very normal state since the 2011 Libyan revolution, which overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, and since what happened then with the instability of numerous governments and the breaking up of the country. Will be interesting to see, and it also will be quite fascinating to see what compromises are made to the different factions when inevitably the government formation is made officially.
Yeah, I mean, a significant element to look at is that the military commander who sort of went rogue and established this Libyan National Army, Haftar, has sort of been sidelined by his own set of government in the east.
Mm-hmm.
He's seen his own significant inability to sort of hold power as effectively. So my own speculation would be that other key interests within that government is hoping to play themselves more favorably to the internationally recognized government of national accord to try and gain some form of established power. It will be interesting to see what type of element they have as the head of the government, whether they'll try and establish a sort of dual system, or if they'll go for a single leader. But obviously these are going to be very tense negotiations, and I imagine it will be definitely a few months before we hear anything concrete. But continue to listen to The World Tonight to find that out in the future.
Yeah, indeed. And one last point on Libya, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, is that they actually resumed oil production earlier this week, selling it off internationally and domestically. So maybe that's also another good sign as well.
Yep, that is exactly right, especially because it will allow a steady stream of economic income to come to the country to hopefully actually bring about some form of rebuilding efforts, because that is going to be key, especially for infrastructure between the two sides. But I think I'm just going to leave it there and then pass on to another key bit of internal instability for an African country, and we're going to the police brutality protests in Nigeria. I'll just let Peter give the overview of this.
Yeah, so earlier this week, there were demonstrations in Nigeria in the city of Lagos, which were waving Nigerian flags, protesting the government recent actions, and a secret group of police called SARS, I believe, which is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, decided to open fire. This has caused numerous deaths, multiple injuries on a peaceful protest. There was no violence at all. And the country, of course, has been plunged into chaos because of this. And the city itself has been put on 24-hour curfew. And it's alleged that the government was also blocking ambulances from to reach the site of where the victims were killed or wounded in this assault. It should be noted, of course, that Nigeria has had problems, not just recently, but historically, with... Oops.
It's all good there.
I didn't realize, Borat's not, advertising on The World Tonight. But...
Well, that's a foreshadowing for the loser of the week. But anyway,
back to Nigeria. But yes, Nigeria's had issues with overuse of force, and especially with this unit, particularly having been controversially used for torturing and killings in the past as well.
Yeah. So you did a great job there of just overlooking at the scene at the moment. But just to look at a bit of the history of the protests. So these protests began on the 7th of October, primarily with young people demanding the scrapping of this mentioned Special Anti-Robbery Squad. They have been sort of a key element of protesters in the past in Nigeria, primarily because they've been accused, with evidence being quite plentiful, of attacking and killing people extrajudicially, as well as other elements of allegations of torture and so forth. Now, the unit was dissolved days later after the protests, but they have continued on demanding reform. Protesters have demanded general reform to the Nigerian government to make it more democratic, less corrupt, that kind of thing. Now, the real interesting thing to see here is that the Special Anti-Robbery Squad has been replaced by a new Special Weapons and Tactical Unit instead. And many protesters in the country believe this is merely a uniform change that won't really fix the systemic issues. And I would add that it's very interesting to read accounts of those who live in Nigeria to see why these systemic issues are coming about. So one of the key things I saw is that they have very archaic views towards young people specifically. So take, for example, they have in the past shot young people who have had expensive watches, have had laptops, have had expensive cars, but don't look the part of one who has that much money. And the allegations there is that they are in this archaic view of seeing wealth as being, it has a particular look, rather than in the, the 21st century of being quite indistinguishable, really, especially because of how cheap these products have become and so forth. But yes, that has been an interesting element to look at, and primarily why it's young people who are at the center of this, because they're the ones really bringing about this cultural change in Nigeria, and the police's inability to really respond to it has definitely caused a lot of resentment. And the further escalation of shootings by security forces, which have killed at least 12 in Nigeria, definitely continues this element of people wanting to see reform to the police because of its corruption. Some have stated that the only real way to actually fix a system like this is to either, replace the people who are currently in it and serving as old, who've been in it for years and years, who don't understand that culture and the times are changing. Also, some others want to see them have, some form of psychological test to try and reaffirm the very nature of modern Nigeria. But definitely a very, very interesting look at police brutality in a non-Western country, because it's never really something that I've seen cropped up, or at least in the international media. Of course, you see very reasonable protests cropping up in the Western world, and they have their own issues that raise for different reasons. But this specific one of it being linked to youth culture and identity in that element has been quite fascinating to read about. So I definitely recommend, if people aren't exactly aware of the situation or may have seen it on very small snippets of it on, say, Twitter or Instagram, to definitely read a lot more into it, because it is a situation that is currently developing and is gives a fascinating insight into a country that not many pay attention to.
Yeah, I think very well spoken. I could have said nothing. Can't say it better than that. I think the other thing is interesting is in Nigeria's case, it's a country that's been labeled by many numerous organizations as a country on the economic high. Very it's considered the most prosperous economic country in Africa, in the African continent, and it's done very well economically, but politically, with a lot of its rankings on human rights and political freedoms, is very low. And of course, should be noted with Nigeria, of course, that there's no topic, it doesn't have any influence on this, but just for historic points, that it's had a very, rough history with its Muslim and, traditional Christian majorities in the countries in south and north. But yeah, it's a country that's had a very rough history since it was handed over by the British back to the people to run. Coups, military massacres. So yeah, it's a very the police brutality aspect. We see a lot of it here in the U.S., UK, in Europe, but criticisms of the police's use of force, and there are legitimate concerns about that. But then we also see and it's very annoying to see the media not cover this as much. Use of forces in other countries where there really is no process to hold any of these officers accountable. They can change the name of a unit, but they're still the same people in those units.
But yeah, I mean, this is something that's happened in the past before, where it's merely gone a uniform change, is the way I've seen it described. Yeah. But overall, I think that's the key points to leave off there. So yeah.
Yeah, and we're actually a little earlier than usual for this segment. But I think before we go into our loser of the week, since what I know a lot of you folks enjoy, just a quick note, two notes actually. First, the American presidential election is only believed now about 10 days away, and if you'd like to watch some fun coverage, tune into the Elections Daily live stream, I believe starting at 7 o'clock on election night, which is Tuesday, November 3rd. And for our international British audience, that would be midnight in the UK.
Gonna have to stay up for that one.
Yeah.
School is a secondary thought to the US election.
Always the fun of sixth form. And secondly, for all usual, please like, Follow Elections Daily. Follow this channel on YouTube so you can get more Elections Daily content and see me and Adam. That who doesn't like to see two nerds talking about international politics? But anyway, yes, and any other podcast services that you may enjoy on your leisure times. Yes, we have a lot of leisure time in this world, so just watch and see us analyzing depressing or happy things. Or complex things. But anyway, we're going to move to the loser of the week, and Adam has someone who has fallen straight from grace to now straight loser of the week. Well, he's been loser of the year for a long time as well.
Right. So yes, the man himself, the former mayor of New York, and the very center of the current Hunter Biden scandals in the U.S. It is Rudy Giuliani, who has been facing some questions after a compromising scene in the new Borat movie. And for those who don't know, it is a sort of mockumentary style where a character from Kazakhstan goes around the United States and essentially makes fun of politicians by setting them up in embarrassing interviews, which they believe to be real, but alas, are not. So this is particularly interesting for being the loser of the week because it has Giuliani, who is 76, going back to his, I believe it is his hotel room with an actor who's playing Borat's daughter in this situation, who's posing as a TV journalist. So in this interview, she is posing for a fake conservative news program in which the pair further retreat at her suggestion to drink to the bedroom of his hotel suite, which is rigged with concealed cameras. So after she removes her microphone, Giuliani can be seen on his bed, fiddling, which is a particular term this article I've seen and others use, with his untucked shirt and reaching into his trousers. Now, you can make your own interpretations there. And to which Borat comes rushing in at this time to describe that his daughter is only 15 and that she's too old for Giuliani, to which Giuliani rushes out of the scene and, everyone laughs. But yes, this is a fascinating look to see how satire on TV is taking a figure who the time this was filmed, obviously it didn't have Giuliani at the very center of American politics because of his involvement with the Hunter Biden email scandal. But to have this arriving now is fascinating, but also it shows a bit of his character. He's claiming that he was only tucking his shirt in this very compromising scene. So yes, it's just a fascinating look into satire and how politicians really need to control themselves.
Yeah, I mean, whether he was fiddling or just touching the mic or whatnot, I really don't want to get too involved. It's always the fun saying you should always research who you're talking with. Always, that's always, I think, a good life lesson. That, and it really is. There's obviously the Hunter Biden stuff. That may be true, may be wrong. I mean, that's for others to decide. I mean, we're not touching that because that's not our purview of news. But people are free to do that. And speaking of Rudy, this is just to extend this segment in a bit. There was a controversy this week with one Rudolph Giuliani of texting with a college teenager who was posing as Ivanka Trump. Now, yes, It is funny, but the worst part of this is, and just to add on to Adam's loser of the week, is that media figures like Rachel Maddow and others thought this was actually real and retweeted it, only to be told by right-wing media, no, this is actually not true. It's an 18-year-old pretending to this, to which, of course, the embarrassment was put on, these individuals' faces for falling for the trap, and also Rudy as well.
But yes, he's a fascinating character, specifically to look at. And to be honest, I want to say this fantastic element that I forgot to talk about in that. But he was talking about in an article, I believe, with the New York Post, that he thought he would never have been able to have been fooled by a character like Borat, and he would have noticed it no matter what, which I think is a particularly funny element of him poking fun of himself. But yes, that is a this is just one of the most light-hearted loser of the weeks I think we have ever had, particularly just because it is quite funny.
Yeah, I mean, Rudy isn't the same Rudy he was, once was. That's the sad point here, but that's a different matter. So on Alf Adams' point, my loser of the week, not as humorous, of course, is the Czech health minister about to be fired for breaking his own lockdown, his own COVID rules. Always fun. Roman.
That's. Sorry, I think that's one of the third loser of the week who's been a politician breaking lockdown rules.
Hey, I mean, we have Dominic Cummings and the I'm already forgetting Maggie.
It was and some other Irish ministers and so forth.
Yes, but, Irish ministers. You gotta love politicians setting rules and not following them. But yes, our friend Roman Permal is resigning. Is being forced out this week because it was photographed by a tabloid newspaper in a restaurant that wasn't following his own recommendation. And his boss, the current Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš, basically told him that he was fired and that he wanted him gone. And now he's following through on that recommendation, which is, loser of the week for suggesting health policies and then breaking them. Always fun.
Wow, that is a slightly light-hearted note to leave this on. Yes. But yes, I think just to summarize a bit of what we looked at in the news a little bit, it definitely does seem like that the key elements of what is important across the world being, the ceasefire in Libya, which I think is crucial for a civil war there, even an element of the Bolivian election, Israel-Sudan normalising ties. These are key elements of the world that are constantly shifting the way in which it works and aren't really being looked at that much. So I'm very glad to be able to have this platform so we can continue talking about these very crucial elements to an audience so that they can learn and develop off of it. But yeah,
I think that's great points. I mean, we're trying to do a service that a lot of traditional media unfortunately has turned a lot of a blind eye to, and we thank you all. A lot of you watch different times for watching us and listening to us, and what comes in the next week will be fun to discuss. I do know just because it is on the agenda and because we have some time left in our allotted schedule I'll ask Adam about a big upcoming event, the U.S. presidential election, and his quick thoughts about it. Adam?
That very topical. Okay, sure. Yeah. Right. So to briefly give my elements in this last 6 minutes we have, I think it will be a Biden victory. I'm very much a stickler for looking at the polls. Obviously, it was a bit wrong to say that after what happened in Bolivia. But in the somewhat reliable element of Bolivian polling, I think it's going to be something where Biden is able to, win. Ultimately, because of elements like the awful, in my opinion, COVID-19 response by the United States and other elements such as people wanting a supposed return to normalcy, this idea of civility in politics, and that general idea as well. I also think that the idea of Bernie Sanders supporters possibly breaking away from a character like Hillary Clinton isn't a factor in this at all. I feel like polling has shown that Bernie Sanders supporters are fairly behind Biden, and the fact Biden is just a far more popular candidate than someone like Hillary Clinton going up against a candidate which has now been, led a pretty disastrous presidency. So yeah, that's just my broad opinions on it. Obviously, I will ultimately be held to those words when it eventually comes to the election, but I will be watching it, specifically the election daily coverage. But I am looking forward to it, actually. I did get to watch, I kind of watched the 2016 election, but I wasn't really paying that much attention because I was 12. So I had like a broad interest in politics, but not that big of it. But now with my hyper-focused mind where I'm caring about like Senate candidates, I've got a few House congressional races I'm watching as well. I think I'm going to have a lot more fun with this election when watching it.
Yes, it's an interesting election in a very odd year. I, of course, have I think it will be interesting to see what happens. If the polling is correct, we very well may be seeing a Biden landslide of which we haven't seen in decades, even bigger than his Barack Obama's win in 2008, possibly. And I think the impact of that, of course, is what it means for the House and Senate. Really, does he have a full trifecta? Does he have a tied Senate? What happens with Mitch McConnell? And obviously, the other big, thing it's been stressed in American politics is what will we finally do on the Supreme Court? Will we add? Will we keep it? Will we make term limits? All very fascinating to see where America in the next 4 years is heading and will be. And if Trump does win re-election, what happens to the polling industry? Are they dead? All fun, questions to see that. And I think you have a question from Maya asking you, Adam, what house races are you in? Or are you looking at?
I think the big one for me, and this is a very oddly specific one, is definitely going to be New Jersey's 2nd congressional district. The possibility of having a Kennedy replace the now gone Joe Kennedy III of Massachusetts is going to be a fascinating element to look at, and also to see how I always find party switching a fascinating element of democracies in general, and see how it plays off to those incumbents who do decide to switch parties. So that'll definitely be a key one for me. And I mean, in terms of other ones, I think Arkansas as well, Montana's as well. Yeah, Arkansas's 2nd district, and then Montana as well. I think the another element that I like looking towards besides party switches is candidates running in states that broadly don't do very well for that candidate. And I know obviously it's because certain congressional districts concentrate in areas where you'll find that Democratic support or Republican support. But yeah, I think those two are going to be the main ones. And specifically, just to say which Senate race I'm most looking forward to is definitely Iowa. I find rural, more rural style politicians fascinating. And to have someone who sort of sells themselves as a retail politician, it's just a fascinating element to look at. So that would be my key watch of the night for the Senate as well as the House. But do you have any interesting House races or Senate races that you're particularly looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward on the Senate side. I think we both have the same Senate seat in mind. I think I'm really interested to see Iowa. Polling there has been really tight this week, and that very well could be the Senate seat that determines the majority. If Democrats pick it up, that could be seat 51. If Republicans hold it, it might be the seat that keeps them in the line. Get a 50-50 Senate or a 51-49 Republican Senate. I think that's a race I'm interested in looking at in the Senate. I mean, the other Senate race I'm kind of interested to look at is, in a sense, might not be done that night. But what happens with the Georgia races? What's the margin? Do we have a runoff? Do we have 2 runoffs in January? That's what I mean. And in the House, I think what I'm interested in looking at is probably a Minnesota 7th Colin Peterson seat. Might be one of the few bright spots for Republicans on a really possible bad night. But the other seat I'm also interested in looking at is, a lot of these, so-called suburban seats that, Republicans still hold that might be in danger of falling. And a seat like that I'm interested in seeing is Arizona 6. Current incumbent is scandal prone, and it's an area that's changing. I think that's an interesting race. Another race you mentioned, Arkansas 2, is really going to be a fascinating one to watch.
I also think California's 25th, just because of how tight it seems to be there for a Democrat who should typically be doing very well in this situation, but really falling behind there. I think that those are going to be interesting to watch. And
it is interesting to see that California, even though it's a good year for Dems, there are a lot of House races, possibly with Dem incumbents, that are really shaky on the ground, which is fascinating.
I mean, just as a final point, I don't want to overrun too much talking about the US, but it's the same with the Senate, really, because you're seeing candidates for example, North Carolina being very, very, looking like it's going to be much closer than it would have been months ago. You're seeing candidates in Michigan. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be as tight as people are expecting, but obviously, it's a race there which isn't looking the greatest. But you're seeing someone like Harrison in South Carolina doing much better than you'd ever expect from a Democrat in the region. So, yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing to look at this election, is just how well Democrats are going to be able to expand their base in states they never typically pick up. But yeah, that's all from me.
Yes, and I think we've exhausted our time, and I want to say thank you to all who watch this show. It means a lot. And I thank Adam for always taking the time out of his very busy day to co-host, a very fun, friendly co-host. And thank you all. We'll see you next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, or 10 British time. And enjoy the next week. Stay safe and keep on watching.
Yep. See you.
Have a great night, folks.